that the shot? Why is that the shot you took? Honest to goodness, man. This thing was on airplane mode, and I got it running, and I set it to take set up the video, and I didn't care what the thumbnail is for this. And so I'm sitting there, okay, just take your thumbnail. And I'm like, okay, I'm trying to look down at my notes, look up, and it's still at 2 seconds. I look down at my notes, find the thing I'm looking for, look up, and it's still at 2 seconds. I'm like, why is this taking so long? And right when I said, I think what I said was, why is it taking so long to take this shot? And right when I was in the middle of the word shot, it took it. So my mouth is open as I'm speaking. Alrighty. It looks like I'm going, oh, that's not what I'm doing. I'm like, why is it taking so long to take this shot? And it caught me right at that moment. Anyway, that aside, doing a little bit better each day. Headed back to work tomorrow after the day off. Sort of. I ran errands today. But the effects of working tomorrow may be interesting to see what they do to me. Because, I mean, I still get a little bit of this lingering around in me. And I feel like it's going to be more obvious when we get a full day of work out of me, what it does to me. That's not where we were going with that. So I did some renaming. No, let's not do that. There we go. I went through Google Translate, and I did some renaming of some of the groups to more fit what I wanted to do with it. And some of those were things that I was talking about renaming last night, I think. Trying to get around some of the issues with the recognizability of certain terms being used differently. So I'm tending to go more back towards the mythological origins of a term. And literature has twisted some of those meanings over time. But what I ended up looking at was, okay, and there was another one that I sort of did for a particular reason. When we were looking at my half-breed races for the Nomoid races, we had to look at halfling. We needed to figure out what else to do for elf and dwarf. I had a feeling I wanted to go a certain way with dwarf, and I kind of know what I want to do for the elves now. The halfling, I kind of early on figured out something that should work for that. But next to that is the half dwarf. And I'd use the term rotu, R-O-T-U, for the half dwarf. It's from the Finnish word, I believe, that means race, which is really half of what I want it meant to mean. And so I went back and pulled some of that up, and the other half of that would be, because I want them to be sort of a subject race that's sort of a half-breed. It's seen as lesser because they're less. There is, oh, for pity's sake, why are you freezing up? Stop crashing my computer, please. I don't know what's going on with this, but it's not funny anymore. The half dwarves would be essentially, I want to be a half race. And so if Rotu is race, then looking up the Finnish word that pairs with it to be half race would be Poli, or P-U-O-L-I, I think is what we're going for it. Technically, I guess it's Poliurotu. I guess it's sort of a half attempt at translation, gets us the term half race. And so that's where I went with that one. The halfling, which is another half race technically, but the halflings or hobbits, I struggled with that for a little bit because Tolkien sort of obscured where he got it from. There's some people who speculate that hobbit, rabbit, was used as part of the foundations of that. And it's funny because nobody mentions, and not too many sources that I've seen mention the hob being a sort of familiar name to give to hobbits or short furry house elves, essentially would be called hobs. And I'm pretty sure that's where he's getting it from. And it may be just internalized folk history from its northern English to call a house elf of miniature portions, that's a hairy little house elf, to call it a hob or a hobgoblin. And that's partly, it also partly comes from Robin Goodfellow is another way to say it. And one of the other versions of that, if you look at, I believe, Shakespeare, Midsummer Night's Dream, Robin Goodfellow is a character named Puck. He's referred to, at least at one point, as being Robin Goodfellow, also known as Puck. But when you really look into the roots of the term Puck, you wander around and you get into Pook, which has relations to Puka, but it's slightly not quite the same thing. Mythology's funny because as you travel from town to town, the meaning of a thing and the meaning of a certain being changes. As you move across the ancient world through different populations, their relationship with the environment and the neighboring tribes affect how they see the same thing. And so I decided just Pook halflings to call them Pook. But that's, I mean, we can just keep calling them halflings if we want to. That one doesn't hurt so much as needing something specific for the dwarf elf, the dwarf gnome, the elf gnome, the half dwarf, and half human. Those all needed a specific term for them. They're not something that has a literature-based term for most of those. And so I had to find things for those. Half elf works, I guess. But the primary purebred races that I'm going to be using here, that's not the right, there we go, purebred races are the dwarf, elf, and gnome. I'm debating whether or not I want to change the gnome to something else. Or what I've done with the dwarf is call them the Dvrgr dwarves. What I found out for the elves is in a line from Norse mythology, you have a reference to some of the controversy of whether or not elves are dwarves and whether or not the dark elves and the dark dwarves are the same race. And there's Dok Alfar and Svart Alfar, and they're sort of used interchangeably, and there's a little question about some of that. And then there's Liet Alfar, I guess I may not be pronouncing that right, but it's essentially the light elves and the dark elves. And I was reading this little bit of research that I was doing, and it said basically like one of the people who was referring to them was stating where you could find them. And one of the things they said was the light elves could be found in several worlds. And part of that was the 9 realms of Norse mythology. When Ragnarok happens, the spirits of the noble dead will have to go somewhere else because Asgard isn't going to be a home to them anymore. And so they'll likely move off into 2 other realms that'll house them. But as far as we know, the only ones there right now are the light elves. And one of the places they name is a land called Andlang, Andlang. And I'm like, I sort of like linguistically I'm thinking of, and it's a total bastardization here. That's what happens with a lot of this right now. But when I'm looking at these races, I look at the Dvrgr, the dwarves, as being very Slavic. But I want to imagine the elves to be more. This started with a discussion of the tendency for literature shorthand to adopt certain cultural identities for mythic races. So when you have a dwarf, you're used to thinking of like Gimli from Lord of the Rings with that sort of Scottish accent. And it's sort of become cliche. It's a shorthand we all recognize. And if you do something else, it's going to be slightly disorienting until we get used to it. And so I was playing around. I was having a conversation with some people about that and saying like, yeah, if you really think about it from a certain standpoint, shouldn't like the dwarves have more of a Swedish, Dutch, Norway, Danish sort of accent? But it feels weird to look at it that way. And then I got to really playing around with it. Like, all right, so if we just get rid of all the presuppositions of the dwarves and we just full on pick one that fits the style of the way you want them to live in your setting, and you pick an accent that suits that, there's sort of like a romantic vision of the tough, sturdy, not afraid to get your hands dirty, practical, and blunt Slavic peoples. There's a certain way of looking at specifically Russians, but I guess it translates a little bit into some of the other Slavic races, or I don't think we can call them races at this point, but ethnic groups. You have this tendency to be very sort of like if you look at the way they're portrayed in pop culture, media, fiction, literature, there's sort of like a solidness, a stoniness, a not phased by things. We would call it a machismo over here in the U.S., partially, I think, from Latino influences, but you have this sort of like it doesn't have to be negative. There's a sort of you look at what it was, Dolph Lundgren in the Rocky movie. You look at Arnold Schwarzenegger's character in, what's the Red Heat or something like that. They're just these Herculean, large, strong, not quite monosyllabic, but like no pretty words, just true words. And it's like that sort of like stone. And it's like, I like that kind of feel for the idea of the dwarves. And so I said, like, I do kind of want them to have a little bit more of a Slavic sense to them. But by the same token, when analyzing the other races that we have to play with, I kind of want the elves to really fit some of the unusual worldview we had when we first encountered East Asian communities. That really unusual sense of like, here is a whole nother people. They're not like anything else we've encountered yet. And our tendency to look at East Asia as mystical and spiritual and that sort of thing is sort of how we tend to portray elves in fantasy mythology. I mean, you could very easily just pull in a Japanese person into, say, a Germanic tribe, and they would be elves. Like, if you never named the region of the world they came from, and you just put somebody in with these features and the way they conduct themselves, the pale skin, the long flowing hair, the graceful movements, the mysticism and magical nature of them, the fact that in certain Asian communities there's the sense that a therapy for stress is to go walking in the forest. It's called, I think it's like forest bathing or something like that. And so like that speaks to elves. And so why wouldn't we use East Asian concepts in naming and approaching their cultural views? And so I look at that and I kind of want to do a Japanese approach or a certain Chinese regions as an approach to informing how we build the culture in the Fey, the Elvish society. But in playing around with that, when I remember, sort of backtrack here, when we started, I talked about how I was doing some research about the Andlang, Andlang, being the realm in which the light fairies or the light elves would reside until such time as Ragnarok happened and the spirits of the noble humans would move into that realm after Ragnarok. But that Andlang, that Lang in particular, has a very Asiatic sound to it. And in formal Chinese, I believe Mandarin, might be Cantonese, Lang is wolf. And it's sort of a bastardization here to use it sort of like twofold in that sense. But the And portion of it is also part of where we get the, I believe, if I remember correctly, I have to look it up again, but I believe Andlang, I looked up the etymological roots for that, and I believe it translates roughly to And is light? No. That might be I'll have to look that up. But I do know in Greco-Roman, android and androgyny, and the and prefix means man. And so the possibility of doing the Wolfman translation of that, while also using the long as the wolf and the and from another language. It's totally butchering languages together, but it sort of fits sound-wise and culturally modeling after them. But so the Andlang, and then it sort of fits right after that to just say the Andlang Fey. Fey being another name for pretty much any kind of elvish spiritual being from Norse mythology. So Andlang or Andlanger is described as the second heavenly realm, which stretches between the first, containing the halls of the gods, and the third, named Vidblain, which is actually the other place that currently is inhabited by elves. And it will serve as the shelter and dwelling place for the souls of the dead during and after the destruction of Ragnarok. So Andi in Norwegian means spirit, which was another way of saying elves in a lot of ways. So let's see. So it says, Holtzmark noted that, and so it's a scholar studying it, adding her own insight that and heading made the term readily associable with andi, which is spirit, and which was in a way synonymous with elves, which fits with the fact that Snorri, the scholar who wrote the excerpt that we're talking about, described light elves as denizens of the third heaven. So another attempt at interpretation include long or far breathing and limitless either, which identify the stem and as breath. It has also been glossed as endlessly long, so eternal elves or the eternal people. So it has multitudes of meaning. That phrase, just every ounce of it seems to be fitting what I want it to fit. So going with Andlang Fey seems to work right now. So that's what I guess that's a long ramble just to say that, Ken. And then, the humans, different communities can call themselves different things. I don't really worry too much about that. The Pook, halfling, the Dvrgr for the dwarves. Now, there is a term for, let's see, pull back up Google Translate. It's a fun little toy to play with to do some of this stuff. I don't know why it defaulted to Japanese, but Swedish for brownies or other fairy is Nisse. Let's see if we can get it to pronounce it so in a way you can hear it. Nisse. That's Swedish. I wanted to go with Icelandic. So gnome is sometimes no, that's not where we're going with that. Yes, gnome pulled up Dvrgr, and that's not what we're looking for. So let's go with Swedish, Finnish. Let's try Swedish. Gnome. where Dvrgr. Finnish. I feel like Finnish was the one that I'm trying to find where. Okay, let's just do a. Let's not do a Google Translate. Let's just do NISSE. So Danish. There we go. So NISSE is a mythological creature from Nordic folklore, today typically associated with winter solstice and Christmas season. It is generally described as being no taller than 3 feet, having a long white beard, and wearing a conical or knit cap in red or some other bright color. That's a gnome, but the word for it is NISSE. And so they're going with Norwegian or Danish? Norwegian or Danish? Let's go backtrack. Norwegian, Norway. Let's try, we can try Danish too. So Danish. Which is sort of a pixie. Nisi. So there is variation in how they pronounce it. Norwegian. What does Norwegian say? Oh, Nisi is Santa in Norwegian. Okay. Nisa. So different pronunciations wherever you go on that one. But I'm debating whether or not that's what I want to drop in on the gnomes. But as I've done so far, the Dvrgr elves, the Andlang Fey, and the Nisa gnomes works as a preload. And like the Pook halflings works as well. So I think that in general sort of does the names for the gnomoid races. Now, I'm still working on trying to figure out what to do with the kobold, because that one not only is the concept of the being we're calling a kobold not what the mythology says, but the name could be used vastly differently too. So renaming the kobold is something I kind of want to do. Troll, we can leave. The other two that are on there are like the Kai Rock. That's an original chunking of word gibberish for my part. And then the Fetch is based off of actual Irish mythology. And that doesn't need to be fiddled with too much. So right now, renaming the kobold is important. And then a few of the sub-races of the half-breeds for the Boreans. So with the half-breeds, I did find one. The Fetch is essentially a shapeshifter, similar to a doppelganger. And the half-breed between the Fetch and the Troll, I did a little digging around and found something that seemed to fit that. It was the Dvrgr. And let's see if I made the note. I'm trying to do better about keeping notes about what each of them means. The Dvrgr is another form of shapeshifter in one of the mythologies that I encountered. Let's see if I can pull that out. Find roots to it, because that's a distinct enough name that you're not going to find, 5 different references for what it supposedly means. So Dvrgr. The Dvrgr, also known as the Vardivel or Dvrgr, is a spirit predecessor of the Scandinavian folklore. Stories typically include instances that are nearly data. So, oh yeah, I remember now. This is so the Dvrgr is essentially a spirit that precedes you wherever you're going and does the things you would do in that location. And it's sort of blamed for deja vu. So like somebody might be walking about town, think they see you doing something, but you don't respond when they call out. And then an hour later, they run into you and goes, "Oh, hey, I tried to reach you earlier." And I was like, "Yeah, I was back home showering." And no, I saw you down at the store. And like, no, I was back home. And so like that's their attempt to explain that situation. So I thought that was kind of interesting, where somebody sees you somewhere you're not. And so I feel like, yeah, that kind of fits the idea of a shapeshifter that I wanted to portray there. And it sort of also does a little bit for like the things like dwarves or trolls that they're supposedly part of. Now, I think I'm probably going to go with just the Karas for the Tengu. The Kenku is what we usually use in D&D for those. The Karasu Tengu is a raven or crow spirit troll in Japanese mythology, I believe. So just using the Karas, Karas, works. We can go with that for now. And it's not like you can't decide at a later date that that's just one tribe's name for themselves. The other thing I wanted to alter for a name for a group was the calling something a half ooze really wasn't working for me. Basically, at a certain point, we have the mythic races. And the mythic races are the elementals, the animals, the plants, without spoiling it too much, the Mon and the Healy, and then the giants, dragons, the giant bird, whichever I choose to call that one, and then oozes, or puddings, or jellies, or however you want to describe them. I may come up with a different name for that group, but they're less likely to come up very often because they're going to be a mythic race. So you're going to see them about as often as you're going to see dragons and elementals and giants. Now the giants, I may just go with the Jotun, which is the Norse mythology term for them. I might go with the rock, ROC, for the giant bird. But for the half oozes, where the parent is called ooze and they are just half ooze, I don't think that's the way we want to go. I'm trying to avoid a lot of that kind of, well, these are half gnomes. No, I don't want to do that. That's the shortcut version of things. That's not the approach I want to take. So I was doing a little looking around like, okay, so these are jelly people. They look like jellyfish if they were human form. That's the premise. So what do you make of these beings? Well, I did a little looking around and I just plugged into Google Translate the words jelly. And wow, apparently jelly is a word we all have in common. You can literally go to Japan, China, Germany, Finland, Sweden, Ireland, native Irish language, and all the others. Well, actually, I did Irish last. I'll get to that one in a minute. But almost every language I plugged into place came up with some form of jelly. Russian came up with jelly. they used Cyrillic letters to spell it, but it was jelly. Jelly is jelly wherever you go. And so I thought that was kind of funny. So I said, gel. Let's see what gel comes up, and still hit many of the same hurdles. And I was like, they can't all be the exact same word wherever you go in the world. But I landed on Irish with the word gel. And one of the options was Glothak. And I'm like, oh yeah, that works perfectly. That's exactly what we need. So I plugged in Glothak as the name for them. And looking further into it, the actual sort of etymological roots of the word Glothak are something of gelatinous nature. And I'm like, yes, that's perfect. I was like, that works perfectly well. And so I thought, like, yep, that's where we're going with that one. So it's every now and then you find one that, like, it feels hard at first, but when you find the right thing, boy, is it the right thing. So that leaves me a few remaining to rename on some of those. Now, I did sort of continue to play around a little bit with my oh great, a stink bug in the house. That's great, thanks. I need that flying around while I'm sleeping. I have that paranoid fear of it flying into my mouth if I open my mouth in the middle of the night. Ugh. But all right, so yeah, so I did a little bit of the modeling out of the stories of the gnomoid races. I still haven't come across humans' dark secrets yet. I mean, honestly, like, if I'm just brainstorming it, like shooting it right now, like, we have the gnomes. They are essentially a race of Dr. Moreau. They meddle with animals and tweak them to become humanoid versions of themselves. Got it. That's their own sort of dark, twisted little environment. The dwarves, they have captured dragons and are butchering them alive for meat, bone, leather, all the materials of crafting and all the things they do, even some of the chemistry they use to do some of their other works. This is harvested from these living dragons that they're harvesting these pieces off of and letting them heal back. And that's dark. That works. It's brutal. It's but you can also kind of see how it happened and why it is what it is. You live in a world where you have to feed your population. There aren't broad fields to grow crops in. There aren't trees and mines that you can harvest important materials from. And there are these huge, monstrous beasts that attack and destroy your communities. Like, I can totally see, like, you capture one of these things, you hate it. It's killed your people for generations. It just also happens to be able to provide you everything your community needs. And in a way that you don't have to hunt them over and over and over again. You can pen one up and just whittle pieces off of it. It's like, it's dark, but you can kind of understand how it happened. And the elves are sort of twofold, going a little dark. They have their own, they build these golems out of parts from condemned criminals, and they also graft in living tissues into their own bodies to augment themselves. So that's sort of dark in their own right. We've got those are the three of the four gnomoid races. The last one is humans. So if I'm just shooting from the top of my head, we haven't really covered the fact that in this setting, every being on the side of good is theoretically descended from and allied with the first mothers. But somewhere in the history of events happening, there's a betrayal and potentially murder of the first mothers. And are humans the one who did it? I mean, the other route we can also go with that is when you look at the humans as a entity, you have the aspect of all the bestial, like the Murs, the centaurs, the satyrs, the minotaurs. These are human animals. Of the mythic races, you have the giants, the dragons, the rocks, the oozes, the plants, animals, and elementals. All versions of these things are spawned from chaos, potentially influenced by the first mothers, however you want to do that. But their half-breeds are all half-breeds of humans. So perhaps the darkest aspect of humanity is, and it sort of fits with their role in the setting as being sort of like the most flexible. We are the most varied. We have so many different phenotypes and cultural types, languages and cultures, ethnic groups. Like, we are as varied as could be. You get a community of humans that live among the gnomes. They will act and function within the gnomish community. We are adaptable. Ultimately and fully, we are the most adaptable of the races. So is it entirely possible that we are sort of a traitor race? Some of us allied with the other races. Some of us maybe sided with the other side. So I'm not sure which of those, or if both of those potentially work. Having each one have a dark crime that fits them is sort of part of the setting for the Empyrean realm. I think I'll probably tomorrow get into some of the sub-realms. I might start with the Sentinels, work my way through the Merc Riders setting, and down into the Medusan setting, the Serpent's Children, because I think for the most part, I've got the rough idea of the settings in a playable fashion now, but there's sort of also a story arc that runs from where the characters are going to land in that setting and what's going on in that world that they have to pay attention to and potentially become involved in. So I have most of that worked out specifically for the Sentinel setting and for the it's been so long since I turned that off, I can't find the button. The Sentinel setting I've got worked out. I've got the Merc Riders setting worked out. The Medusa Serpent's Children setting is still a little up in the air, although analyzing the structures I'm using for the arcing plots within those worlds sort of leads me to like, oh, I can see where my brain would go in that direction for them. They have a distinctive theme that sort of pairs with the overarching idea of like, who are you as the player, as the group, and as the DM? Like, who are we? We start in one world, we think we know who we are. You land in another world where your body and your circumstances, your social position, your knowledge, they're all different, but you're still you. And who is that you are? That thought process, that mentality, you can look at the different settings that I'm building as the settings that you fall into or move through. And each one of them explores some degree or aspect of what that means, like drawing out some truth in that regard, whether it's what does it mean when you turn into one of the monsters, and monsters aren't just something else, but you're one now? Are you a monster? What defines a monster to you at that point when you find you have some connection to them? And then over into another setting where the question of how do you relate to a world with sickness in it like that. And so there's what does it mean to be handicapped or ill or chronically ill, and how do you relate to the others around that sense? And what does it mean to become ill like that? How does that affect you? And then like the third setting, if we're taking this idea of like analyzing who are you and what does it mean, there are a couple different levels of approach I can take to that from the Serpent's Children setting. So I'm going to play with that a little bit more. I haven't really figured out what angle I'm going to approach it from. I could potentially do more than one angle for that setting. And it would be unique in the fact that it's not an overarching background storyline going on with side stories and mini adventures that you participate in, along with the overarching story of being fallen gods trying to find your way back. It's a tangled web, but if you build it right, all the lines lead to important ideas and philosophies. And so it's part of the reason why I'm so thoroughly enjoying doing this, is because it's a combination of philosophy, sociology, psychology, mythology, anthropology, and gaming systems, making games and stories. And I sort of love all of the pieces of it. And etymology, there you go, there's another one I forgot. I sort of love just playing around with these things and building a world. And there's a part of me that just desperately wants to say like, okay, let's get some people playing in it, but I don't think we're there yet. I can potentially do some early adventures in it. And I did come up with a very simple sort of a test run scenario that I was partially hinting at last night, where there's the idea of doing a prologue. Essentially, if you're writing a book, you write a action themed bit that explains the nature of the world you're in the first 10 pages of your book, usually within the first 4 pages of the book. So you'll have a scene where, you know, you open up the book, you know it's going to be fantasy, but that's kind of all the information you have right now. And that first scene should set up who are the races in your setting, where do they live, is this an island nation, is this a peninsula, are they surrounded by the mountain ranges that they live in? Build the setting, build the races, build a introduction to the major conflicts at the center of your world, and more specifically, a sense of how the game will go in that setting. So in that setting, are you going to have a private detective walk onto the scene, or are you going to have a brutal murder happen, and then the rest of the story is the private detective trying to understand what happened and figure out who caused this murder, what circumstances led up to that happening? You set that stage in the first part. That brutal murder happens, and then the rest of the story is trying to figure out the consequences and handle them as a response to that setup. And so I kind of want to do a mini setup, that prologue, where I can have the group of players sit down on a session 0. We're going to build their teenager characters that they'll play in a bit. And we sort of try to spell out a little bit of what's going on and how their characters are going to play in this setting for a session 0. And then you hit them with, okay, here's an introductory adventure. And this has a sort of a history of a lot of people who got into the early Dungeons and Dragons potentially played a box set called the Red Box. And the Red Box had a sort of choose your own adventure. It's not the best choose your own adventure that's ever happened, but it's it's sort of like gets you in the sense of these are the things you can do. You're put in this position, make a choice. And your goal is to make the right choice about going in a certain direction. And that Red Box mini adventure that starts off as a tutorial also does something that's important to new players of a game like Dungeons and Dragons. And that is, in that adventure, you encounter a snake. And so it tells you, okay, here's this snake. This snake is going to miss you every time because right now we're just trying to show you how to attack it. So you attack it, roll your dice. If you get this, you take this many hit points off of the snake. If you get this, you finally defeated the snake. You move on. If your hit points drop below a certain point, that's I think a later conflict is a different monster or something, and you're fighting that monster, and they can do damage to you. They kind of set it up so that you can't really lose that one yet. But the setup is such that, okay, now I know when we're playing the game for real, when we move out of this introduction and play the game for real, these are the same steps that I'm going to take when we play. And I've learned them through playing with them right now. And so I kind of want to build a scenario like the intro to the Red Box. Mine is going to be a little bit less of a you can't lose and a little bit more of a you kind of have to lose. It's a little railroady, but you kind of have to die. So you build the first intro setting is basically you start in the middle of a action scene where you're fleeing from people or enemies of some kind, and you're being attacked, leaving one of the floating islands to go to the main continent. You get on one of the boat vessels that helps you travel that distance, and you're attacked while you're trying to get away. You crash land. You struggle with whoever was attacking, and you manage to get away to confront other people who, at first, you're not sure which side they're on, and it's introducing the internal political conflicts within the whole of the realm. And then sort of in order to save the day, you have to sort of make a last stand and help somebody else escape or something of that sort. And so you end that intro with, and you make that last stand. And then you move on, you start over with every player playing a teenager ready to become a hero in the realm. Now, that's a little dark, and I don't know that I want to set the tone right off the bat is completely dark like that. Because, I mean, there will be darkness, but I do want you to start as a teenager, living this sort of good life as a villager on a floating village off of the mainland island continent of the Imperial Realms, and seeking adventure and glory, to be a champion and a hero to your people. That's not usually something you do from a start of there's political intrigue in the background, people murdering each other and betraying each other, and a dark secret in the background. I don't necessarily want to cloud the heroic adventure set out on from the beginning with that tone of failure, death, or sacrifice, death, and betrayal going on. I want it to start with that happy, adventurous, heroic setting and gradually lead to these darker twists that you uncover as you continue to play. So I'm debating. I may have to tone back my intro adventure. But part of the intro adventure, spoilers, is a piece of hidden precious cargo. And that hidden precious cargo that you're trying to get away from the conspiracies that are out to stop it is at least a link to what you need to bring the First Mothers back. And so it's also potentially, if you remember any of the other world building that I've done so far, it's also potentially spoilerific to say it this way too, but it may be the key to the fourth sub-realm. So we have the Empyrean realm, Merc Riders, Sentinels, Serpent's Children, and then adding that fourth one to test whether or not I've built my system, my templates well enough that you can slot in any other setting you want to do. If I'm building another fourth setting, and it's the hidden secret to the fourth world, it's a little spoilery to do it that way, but if you set it up right, it'll be like an aha moment later on when they figure it out. But there's room also in there for some moments that play out later as well, where you're in that adventure and you're unsure of how things turned out and you're not sure how bad things went. I'll give you the example here where you have a character, either a player character or a non-player character, involved in that first prologue conflict. And then you leave it uncertain as to their fate. And then you're visiting the Elvish city. And you're noticing that one of the Elvish nobles is sporting a limb of some kind that bears a mark that belonged to somebody else in the prologue. That person's been butchered and their limb has been used to augment somebody else. And like, that's dark. That's dark. But it fits so nicely. I'm like, I kind of have to do that. But I kind of don't. Like, I don't want to start it out with that. Like, and it's going to be crushing, honestly. I would hope. It's hard to say that. I don't ever want to cause suffering on the part of anybody, but in time, when you write a story about characters, you sometimes introduce scenarios where you're like, I want it to have that emotional impact. And the impact is going to be part of the situation they go through. It's going to hurt to go through. And it's like, you want to have that impact. You're manipulating the emotions of the people, either playing or reading or whatever you're doing with this setting. And I was like, I kind of want to build that because I feel like it's going to be a key moment. But a responsible game master, when you're in the midst of playing this game and you make that reveal, when somebody at the table goes, oh my God, you have to stop. Maybe you all get up for a minute and you just let that soak in and you have a meal. You give yourself a little space to ruminate in that headspace before you come back to it. And I feel like there there's room for each of these things. There's room for a story like this in multiple aspects of just the Empyrean realm. So when we have that first encounter of the dwarves and what they're doing to the dragon, that's going to be like, okay, we need to stop for a minute. We need to step away, take a deep breath. People being monsters, but monsters, you understand why they're doing what they're doing. It's going to be hard to face that. And to me, that's the sign of a really good story, because it's making you examine these things in a way that makes you question, and more often than not, you're likely to land on the side of reinforcing your beliefs, your feelings, your morals, your sense of right and wrong. It makes you examine who you are and what makes you you in a way that you have to sort of reaffirm. It's a test to your sense of self. Would you ever be a monster? When you look at those circumstances, it's the example of like watching a fascist regime take over a country and make a group of other people into the scapegoats and victims of a brutal pogrom of destruction. I mean, the classic example that you get referred to often is the Nazis. If you were in Germany at the time, how could you let that happen? The goal isn't to set them in a scenario where they behave in line with that stream. The goal is to tell a story where we get to practice thinking about how we might not let that happen, how we might react to that scenario, and how looking at that happening, you can be bothered by it. Being bothered by that is the right reaction. So that's sort of where I'm playing with it right now. We're over an hour now. So I'm going to call it here. I think tomorrow I'm going to try it. I keep falling back into this pattern of finding more things to tweak on the Empyrean realm side of things, but I want to sidestep over into some of the subrealms, even rename the concept. I don't want to call them subrealms, but vestigial realms? I don't know. I'll have to figure it out. I will catch you tomorrow, and until then, take care and have a good night. There we go. Take care and have a good night. I'm going to sing my own outro song, I guess. Buenas noches.